Lord Bastwick's hand was already reaching for me. I saw it from across the ballroom, that slow, deliberate stretch of his fingers through the crowd, like a man who had never once been told no and did not intend to start tonight. His eyes were locked on mine, calm, possessive, the kind of calm that had once made me believe he was gentle. I knew better now. My whole body moved before my mind gave permission. I turned sharply, cutting between two women mid-conversation, ignoring their gasps, pushing deeper into the sea of powdered wigs and pearled necklines. The chandeliers burned bright above me. The orchestra played something cheerful and completely absurd given that my hands were shaking. He was still coming. I could feel it. And then the crowd shifted, and I saw the gap closing behind me, and panic made me do something I cannot fully explain to this day. I turned to the nearest figure beside me, a man standing apart from the crowd, broad and unmoving, as though the entire glittering chaos of the room did not concern him, and I stepped directly into his space and gripped the sleeve of his coat. His eyes dropped to my hand, then rose slowly to my face. Cold, searching, absolutely unreadable. The woman beside him sucked in a sharp breath. A nearby lord actually stepped back. I did not understand why. Not yet. Tell me, what would you have done with that man's eyes on you and your abuser steps away? Drop it in the comments. And if this already has you gripped, subscribe, because what happens next changed everything. Lord Bastwick's fingers had already closed around my wrist once this evening. That was how the night began. Not with music, not with candlelight, not with the sweet promise of a winter ball in the grandest house in the county. It began with pain. With the quiet, practiced grip of a man who knew exactly how much pressure to apply before it left a mark, I had pulled free. Barely. My name is Countess Delphine Orvain, and I want you to understand something before this story goes any further. I was not a foolish woman. I was not naive or reckless or without sense. I had survived 2 years beneath Lord Bastwick's roof as his intended. 2 years of learning how to read a room, how to read his moods, how to disappear into a crowd before his temper found a target. Survival had sharpened me in ways that finishing school never could. But even sharp things can be cornered. The Whitmore Winter Ball was held every year at Whitmore Hall, the grandest estate in 3 counties, owned by the ancient and considerably wealthy Whitmore family. Every titled head, every powdered wig, every silk fan and jeweled brooch in the region found its way through those doors by the second week of December. It was the event of the season. It was also, as I had just discovered, a trap with very pretty walls. Lord Bastwick had arrived an hour after me. I had come with my aunt, Lady Orvain, a stout and well-meaning woman who unfortunately had the habit of wandering toward the card tables the moment she entered any room. She had vanished within 15 minutes, leaving me with a glass of warm punch and the growing awareness that I was entirely alone. When I spotted Bastwick near the entrance, my stomach dropped. He had not been invited. Or perhaps he had. It did not matter. What mattered was the look on his face when he found mine in the crowd. Not surprise, not even pleasure. Just that cold, quiet ownership. The expression of a man collecting something that belonged to him. I moved. Immediately. Without grace. Without a plan. The ballroom at Whitmore Hall was enormous. 3 chandeliers dripping with candles, walls lined with portraits of ancestors who all seemed to share the same disapproving brow. The floor was a sea of nobility in their finest, laughing and dancing and utterly unconcerned with the fact that I was threading through them like a woman fleeing a fire. I turned left near the musicians. Bastwick shifted in the same direction. I saw it from the corner of my eye, that deliberate adjustment of his path, unhurried because he had never needed to hurry. He had always known he would reach me eventually. My pulse was loud in my ears. I cut right, past a cluster of young lords arguing loudly about horse racing, past 2 matrons sharing whispered gossip behind their fans, past a footman carrying a tray of crystal glasses who looked at me with wide, startled eyes as I nearly knocked everything sideways. And then the crowd thinned suddenly. A pocket of open space near the far wall, just beside the tall curtained windows. I nearly stumbled into it, and that was when I saw him. He stood completely alone. That alone was strange. At a ball like this, no one of consequence stood alone. You were either dancing, or scheming, or performing the very elaborate theater of doing neither while clearly doing both. Solitude was suspicious. Solitude meant something. But he simply stood there, one hand clasped behind his back, a glass held loosely in the other, watching the room with the kind of expression that did not belong to a guest. It belonged to someone who owned something far larger than this hall and found the entire display mildly beneath his attention. He was tall, dark-haired, somewhere past 30, with a jaw that looked carved rather than grown and eyes that were, even from a distance, extraordinarily still. Not cold exactly, still. The way deep water is still, I did not think. I want to be clear about that. What I did next was not a decision. It was instinct dressed in desperation. I felt Bastwick behind me, close, too close, and I stepped directly into the tall stranger's space, gripped the sleeve of his coat with both hands, turned my face into his shoulder, and stayed there. The room did not stop. The music did not pause. But something shifted. I felt it. A ripple of awareness moving through the nearby guests, like wind across still water. Whispers. A sharply indrawn breath from somewhere to my left. The man beneath my hands did not move, did not speak immediately, did not pull away. For 3 full seconds, he simply allowed it, which was either extraordinary kindness or extraordinary confusion, and I was too frightened to determine which. Then, low and even, close enough that I felt it more than heard it, he spoke. He is watching you. Not a question, a statement. Delivered with the flat certainty of someone accustomed to reading rooms the way scholars read texts. I know, I whispered. Is he your husband? No. Your guardian? No, he is nothing to me. The words came out fiercer than I intended, shaking at the edges. He is nothing. Another silence. I could feel the stranger's arm, solid and unmoving beneath my grip, not pulling away but not welcoming either, simply present. Then stay, he said quietly. Just that, stay. I did not know his name. I did not know who he was or why half the nearby guests seemed to have gone very carefully still in his proximity. I only knew that Bastwick had stopped moving. I could feel the shift of it, that particular stillness of a predator deciding whether the risk was worth the reward. A full minute passed, then another, when I finally lifted my eyes, very carefully, to scan the room. Bastwick was gone. The relief that moved through me was so strong it almost took my legs with it. I released the stranger's sleeve immediately, stepped back, straightened, lifted my chin the way my mother had taught me when I was 7 years old, and she said, "A lady never lets the world see her kneel." "Forgive me," I said, keeping my voice steady through sheer will. That was unpardonable. I had no right. He looked at me then, fully. And it was the strangest thing, because his expression did not carry offense or amusement or the particular gleam men sometimes got when a woman did something unexpected and they decided to make it mean more than it did. He simply looked at me the way someone looks at a thing they are trying to understand. "You are shaking," he said. "I am perfectly well." "You are shaking," he repeated, exactly the same way, as though my insistence had not registered as relevant information. I pressed my hands together at my waist. They were trembling. I hated them for it. "Thank you," I said, "for not making a scene. I will trouble you no further." I turned to leave. "Countess Orvain." I stopped. I had not told him my name. I turned back slowly, and something about his expression had shifted. Just slightly. Not warmer exactly, but less closed. He set his glass down on the narrow ledge of the window beside him. "You dropped this," he said. He held out a small card, cream-colored, edged in silver. My aunt's calling card, which I had tucked into my glove earlier and apparently lost during my flight through the room. I took it from him carefully. Our gloved fingers did not touch. "How do you know my name?" I asked. "Your aunt pointed you out to me earlier. She is very enthusiastic about introducing her niece to anyone with a title." Something close to embarrassment moved through me. Of course she had. Of course. "I see," I said, very carefully. "And you are?" He looked at me for a moment. Then the faintest thing happened at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. Something smaller than a smile. Something that suggested a smile existed somewhere in the vicinity but had not yet decided to make an appearance. "Someone who will not make a scene," he said. "Good evening, Countess." He turned away, and I stood there, card in hand, heart still hammering. with the absolute certainty that I had just made a monumental mistake without yet knowing the shape of it. I found my aunt at the card tables, naturally. Lady Honoria Orvain was 61 years old, built like a comfortable armchair, and possessed of the singular gift of being completely oblivious to anything that did not directly involve her hand of cards. She looked up when I appeared at her elbow, studied my face with the brief, practiced attention of a woman who had raised 3 daughters, and said, "You look like you have seen a ghost, dear." Something like that. "Sit down. Lord Pennick is about to lose enormously, and it is tremendously entertaining." Aunt Honoria, who is the tall man near the east window, dark hair, stands alone. She did not look up. "Which tall, dark man? This is a British ball, Delphine. There are 17 of them. This one does not mingle. He watches the room. Everyone around him goes quiet." That made her look up. She set her cards face down, which was, for Aunt Honoria, the social equivalent of standing on a table and demanding silence. "Dark eyes?" she said. "Yes." Stands like he is the most important person in any room he enters, not because he is performing it, but because he genuinely cannot conceive of an alternative. I thought about it. Yes, exactly that. She picked her cards back up. "That is the Duke of Grenthorpe, Cassius Aldenmore. Do not pursue that line of thinking, Delphine, not under any circumstance." The name landed in my chest like a stone dropped in still water. The Duke of Grenthorpe. Even I, who had spent the last 2 years trying to survive rather than engage with society, knew that name. Everyone knew that name. The Duke of Grenthorpe was spoken of the way weather was spoken of, as something vast and impersonal, and capable of doing considerable damage. He held 4 estates, a seat in the House of Lords that he occupied with apparently terrifying efficiency, and a reputation that combined, depending on who was telling the story, either ruthless brilliance or ruthless coldness, with no clear line between them. He had also, 3 years prior, ruined Lord Cavett so thoroughly and so quietly that Lord Cavett had simply left England altogether and never returned. No one knew exactly what Cavett had done. No one asked. That was the point. And I had gripped his sleeve like a drowning woman grips a rope. "He told me to stay," I said, mostly to myself. Aunt Honoria's head snapped up again. "I beg your pardon?" "Nothing. Delphine Orvain, what did you do?" "Nothing permanent." She stared at me for a long moment with the expression she reserved for situations that threatened to become complicated. Then she turned back to her cards. "We are leaving at 10 o'clock. Stay where I can see you." I stayed, but my eyes kept moving to the east window. He was gone. The space where he had stood was simply empty now, as though he had been a trick of the candlelight. I felt the absence of him in a way that made no logical sense, because I had known him for approximately 4 minutes and had spent most of that time gripping his coat and lying about being perfectly well. But the room felt different without him in it, louder, less anchored. I was still turning this over in my mind when the second disaster of the evening arrived in the form of Lord Bastwick's sister. Lady Priscilla Bastwick was 24 years old, slim, pale, and possessed of a smile that never once reached her eyes. She had been promised to a young viscount since childhood and seemed to have decided that this fact gave her license to be unpleasant to every other woman in a room. She found me near the punch table, which was where I had retreated after leaving my aunt, and she arrived with 2 companions, a Miss Ottiline Frosh and a Lady Gwendoline Carrick, both of whom I knew well enough to distrust. "Countess Orvain," Priscilla said, in that particular voice she used that managed to make the title sound like an insult. "What a surprise. My brother did not mention that you would be here tonight." "Your brother does not govern my social calendar," I said pleasantly. Her smile sharpened. "No, but he does seem terribly concerned with your whereabouts. He has been asking after you all evening." She tilted her head. "You two had a misunderstanding, I understand." A misunderstanding. 2 years of fear. A wrist gripped hard enough to bruise. A door locked from the outside. Letters intercepted. A broken china figurine thrown at the wall close enough to my head that I had felt the air of it move past my cheek. A misunderstanding. "We parted ways," I said. "That is all. He wishes to speak with you." "I am unavailable." Priscilla stepped slightly closer, lowering her voice to a register that was meant to feel intimate and instead felt predatory. He is not a patient man, Delphine. You know this. It would be far easier for everyone if you simply spoke with him tonight and allowed things to be settled. There is nothing to settle. He disagrees. I held her gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable. Lady Priscilla, I wish you a pleasant evening. I walked away. My hands were shaking again. I pressed them flat against my skirts and kept walking, away from the card tables, away from the east window, toward the long corridor that led to the ladies' retiring room, where I could stand behind a closed door for 5 minutes and remember how to breathe. The corridor was dim and quiet, lit by a single row of wall sconces that cast everything in warm amber. I pressed my back against the wall halfway down and closed my eyes. 2 years. I had given 2 years to that man. Not willingly, not at the beginning. My father had arranged it when I was 22, convinced that Lord Bastwick was everything a match should be: title, land, income, and apparent good manners in company. What happened behind closed doors had not been part of the arrangement. It never was. I had ended it 8 months ago, or I had tried to. Bastwick did not accept the ending. That was the problem. That was why tonight had happened. That was why I had run. That was why I had grabbed a stranger's coat in a crowded ballroom and done something that no gently bred countess had any business doing. The Duke of Grenthorpe. I pressed my fingers to my temple. You are doing it again. My eyes flew open. He was standing 3 feet away in the corridor, which was impossible because I had not heard him, had not sensed him, had not in any way registered his arrival. He simply existed in the space now, leaning very slightly against the opposite wall, arms folded, watching me with that same unreadable steadiness. Shaking, he said, by way of clarification, as though I might have forgotten what word came next. How long have you been standing there? Long enough to hear none of that conversation, but enough to determine that whatever happened there has made it worse. I straightened. You are following me. I am walking to the east terrace. You happen to be in the corridor. The east terrace is in the opposite direction. The faintest pause. I took the long way. Something cracked open in my chest at that. Something unwilling and inconvenient and completely inappropriate for a corridor at a winter ball. I looked at him and he looked at me, and the silence between us was not uncomfortable, which was perhaps the most alarming thing about it, because silence with strangers was supposed to be uncomfortable. That was its function. Your name is Cassius Aldenmore, I said. It is. You are the Duke of Grenthorpe. Also correct. You ruined Lord Cavett. Something shifted in his expression, so small I almost missed it. Lord Cavett made certain choices. I simply made them visible. He left the country. He had reasons to leave the country. I studied his face. In the amber light of the corridor, it was a different face than in the ballroom. Still severe, still unreadable at its depths. But something in the set was less performed, less armored. Why did you tell me to stay? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone avoiding a question. The silence of someone choosing the precise and correct answer. Because whatever was chasing you, he said, you were more frightened of it than of me, and I am not a man most people choose to stand near voluntarily. I did not know what to say to that. Your aunt will be looking for you, he said. He pushed off from the wall. Your Grace. The title felt strange in my mouth, too large, too formal for a corridor, for this strange pocket of honesty we had stumbled into. The man in the ballroom, Lord Bastwick, he will not stop. He paused. I know you have no reason to involve yourself, I continued, because once I had started, I could not seem to stop. I know this is not your concern, and I am a stranger, and what I did tonight was inexcusable, and I am not asking for anything. I simply want you to know that I am not without sense. I am not a foolish woman making foolish choices. I am a woman in a corner, and I am aware of the difference. The Duke of Grenthorpe turned back to face me fully. He looked at me for a long moment. I know the difference, he said finally. I have known it since the moment you let go of my sleeve and apologized for surviving. And then he walked away, and I stood in that amber corridor with my back against the wall, and something I had held tightly inside my chest for 2 years, something hard and frightened and exhausted, loosened, just slightly, just enough to hurt in an entirely different way. The night was not over. Bastwick was still somewhere in that house. Priscilla's words were still coiling in my stomach like cold smoke. But the Duke of Grenthorpe had looked at me, and he had seen exactly what I was. Not a problem, not a query, not a woman making a scene, a woman in a corner. And for reasons I could not yet name, that felt like the most dangerous thing that had happened to me all evening. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the guest room my aunt kept for me at Orvain House, staring at the ceiling while the candle on the bedside table burned itself down to nothing. And I thought about two things in equal measure: Lord Bastwick's eyes finding mine across the ballroom, and the Duke of Grenthorpe's voice in the corridor, steady and precise, saying words that had no business affecting me the way they did. A woman in a corner. He had seen it. In 4 minutes and one corridor conversation, he had seen what my own father had refused to see in 2 years. I turned onto my side and pressed my face into the pillow. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of December morning that felt like the sky had given up entirely. I dressed quickly, ate nothing, and was sitting at my writing desk with a letter half finished to my solicitor when Aunt Honoria appeared in the doorway in her dressing gown, holding a small silver tray. On the tray was a card, cream-colored, heavy stock, no embellishment except a single crest pressed into the corner in dark ink. I knew the crest before I picked it up. "It came an hour ago," Aunt Honoria said, watching me with the expression she reserved for things she had not yet decided how to feel about. "A footman delivered it. Grenthorpe livery." I turned the card over. On the back, in handwriting that was spare and exact and took up very little space, were 7 words. "Lord Bastwick has filed a legal petition." That was all. No signature. No further explanation. No instruction. I read it 3 times. Then I set it down on the desk very carefully, the way you set down something fragile even when it is not fragile at all, because your hands have started shaking and you need them to stop. A legal petition. Of course he had. Of course. Bastwick had clearly decided that if he could not collect me in person at a winter ball, he would collect me through the courts instead. The petition would claim breach of promise. It was the oldest weapon a spurned man of title could reach for, and it was devastatingly effective because it did not need to prove love or intent or anything resembling truth. It only needed to prove that an agreement had existed. And an agreement had existed. My father had signed it. I had been 22 and had not yet understood what I was agreeing to. I stood up from the desk. "I need to see my solicitor, Delphine." "Today, Aunt Honoria, not tomorrow." "Your solicitor," she said carefully, "is Mr. Pettifer of Weld, and Pettifer, who is 63 years old, charges enormously for doing very little, and whose primary skill appears to be writing long letters that say nothing definitive. He cannot help you with a petition from Lord Bastwick. He is the only solicitor I have. He is the only solicitor you have had." She paused. "There are others." Something in her tone made me look at her properly. She was holding her dressing gown closed at the collar with one hand and looking at the card on my desk with an expression I could not quite read. "Aunt Honoria, what do you know?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, with the deliberate care of someone choosing their words like stepping stones across uncertain water, she said, "The Duke of Grenthorpe has a legal counsel. A man named Devoren Holt. He is considered the finest petition advocate in England, possibly in Europe." I stared at her. "He sent you that card before 9 in the morning, she continued. "He knew about the petition before you did. That means he has people watching Bastwick's movements. Which means he anticipated this. Which means, Delphine, that man was not simply walking to the East Terrace last night." The room felt very still. "Why would he involve himself?" I said. "He does not know me." "No," Aunt Honoria agreed, "he does not." She set the silver tray down on the corner of my desk, adjusted her dressing gown, and walked back toward the door. Then she stopped, with her hand on the frame, and said without turning around, "He knew Lord Cavett too, before everything came to light. I always wondered how he knew which stones to lift." She paused. "Perhaps he simply has an eye for corners." She left. I sat back down at my desk and looked at the 7 words on the card for a long time. Then I picked up my pen and began a different letter entirely. I wrote to the Duke of Grenthorpe. It was 3 sentences long. I thanked him for the information, stated plainly that I intended to fight the petition, and asked, without apology and without performance, whether his counsel, Mr. Devoren Holt, might be available to advise me on the matter at his earliest convenience. I sealed it, sent it within the hour. His reply arrived before noon. Mr. Holt will call at Orvane House at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I have taken the liberty of informing him of the relevant details. He will advise you well. And beneath that, in the same spare handwriting, one additional line that had not been asked for and was not strictly necessary, and that I read 4 times before folding the letter and pressing it flat against my desk. You were right. You are not a foolish woman. I pressed my hand over the folded paper, breathed. Then I straightened my spine, called for my maid Otley to bring my gray wool dress, and prepared to fight. Mr. Davarin Holt arrived at precisely 3 o'clock, which I noted because punctuality in an advocate was either professionalism or theater, and I needed to know which kind of man I was dealing with. He was younger than I expected, perhaps 35, with a lean, sharp face, ink-stained fingers, and the particular energy of someone whose mind moved considerably faster than the room around him. He wore his coat slightly crooked and did not seem to notice or care. He sat across from me in the drawing room, opened a leather case with quiet efficiency, and began without preamble. Lord Bastwick filed a petition yesterday evening, he said. He claims breach of formal promise of marriage, citing your father's original agreement dated 3 years prior. He is seeking damages and, more critically, a legal declaration that the agreement remains binding. The word binding sat in the room like something with teeth. Can he obtain that declaration? I asked. Holt looked up from his papers. His eyes were sharp and brown and assessed me with the same flat directness that I had, in the last 12 hours, begun to associate with men employed by the Duke of Grenthorpe. Under ordinary circumstances, possibly, he said. The agreement is documented. Your father signed it in good faith. The law is not particularly concerned with what happens after agreements are signed, only that they were signed. He paused. However, I repeated, there are grounds to challenge. Specifically, if the conduct of Lord Bastwick during the period of the agreement can be demonstrated to constitute harm, the original terms become contestable. The law does not bind a woman to a man who has done her documented injury. I looked at my hands in my lap. The faint yellowed mark on my left wrist, mostly faded now, but still visible in certain light. What constitutes documented? I said. Holt held my gaze without flinching. Witnesses, letters, physical evidence, your own testimony, given under the right circumstances, before the right ears. And if I have some of those things? Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, something closer to grim satisfaction. Then, Countess Orvane, we have a case. We worked for 2 hours. By the end of it, Holt had a list of 4 potential witnesses. 3 letters I had kept hidden in a locked box at the bottom of my traveling trunk for 8 months, because some part of me had always known they might matter, and 1 very detailed account of an evening in March when I had stood in a locked room with nowhere to go and understood for the first time that I was genuinely afraid. When Holt left, I sat in the empty drawing room for a long time. Then the door opened, and Aunt Honoria came in with tea and sat beside me and did not say a single word, which was the kindest thing she had ever done. That evening, a second note arrived from the Duke. It said only, Bastwick was seen at Lord Fenwick Rolfe's club this afternoon. He is building his own list of witnesses. You should know that some of those he is approaching are people who will say whatever he pays them to say. I read it twice, then I wrote back. I am not surprised. I am also not afraid. Not anymore. I sent it before I could reconsider. His reply came the next morning, before I had finished my tea. Good. 1 word. I stared at it for longer than was reasonable for a woman who had a petition to fight, a villain closing in from 2 directions, and approximately no time to be distracted by spare handwriting on heavy cream cardstock. But I stared at it anyway. Davorin Holt returned 3 days later with news that rearranged everything. He sat in the same chair in the drawing room, leather case open, ink-stained fingers moving through papers with that rapid, familiar efficiency, but something in his posture was different, tighter. The way a man holds himself when the information he is carrying is heavier than he expected. Lord Bastwick has retained Sir Gideon Falk, he said. Aunt Honoria, who had taken to sitting in the corner of the drawing room during these meetings on the grounds that it was her house and she would sit wherever she pleased, made a sound that was not quite a gasp, and not quite a word. I looked between them. Who is Sir Gideon Falke? The man, Holt said carefully, who has never lost a petition case in 22 years of practice. The room went very quiet. He is also, Holt continued, setting down his papers and looking at me directly, a personal friend of 3 of the 5 magistrates who would hear this case. He dines with 2 of them regularly. The 3rd was at his daughter's wedding. I understood immediately. The case is already decided. Not necessarily, but the ground we are standing on has shifted considerably. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the December street was gray and frost-dusted. A carriage rolling past, a flower seller on the corner with her basket wrapped in cloth against the cold, 2 children chasing each other around a lamppost with complete disregard for everything wrong in the world. There is something else, Holt said. I turned. He was looking at his papers again, which meant the something else was worse. One of the witnesses Bastwick has approached is your cousin, Mr. Aldous Grenfield. I felt the blood leave my face. Aldous, my father's nephew, a man I had grown up beside, shared Christmas dinners with, lent books to, defended once at a family gathering when an uncle said something unkind about his prospects. Aldous, who had borrowed money from me twice and never repaid it. Aldous, who I had not seen in 8 months, but who I had trusted on some baseline familial level, the way you trust walls to hold simply because they always have. What has he agreed to say? My voice came out very flat. That he witnessed you behave with, and I am quoting the language of the statement here, flagrant disregard for the terms of your agreement with Lord Bastwick, including conducting yourself improperly with other gentlemen in public settings. The ballroom. Someone had seen me at the ballroom. Someone had reported it to Bastwick, and Bastwick had taken it to Aldous, and Aldous had agreed to shape it into a weapon. I pressed my hand flat against the cold glass of the window. Improperly, I said. It is vague deliberately, Holt said. Vague implies more than it states. That is the point. He means the Duke of Grenthorpe. My own voice sounded strange to me, too controlled. Someone saw what happened in the ballroom and told Bastwick, and now he intends to use it. Holt was quiet for a moment. It would appear so. I turned from the window. Something had solidified inside me. Not anger exactly, though anger was certainly present. Something harder than anger. Something that had been building for 2 years and had finally found its final form. Send word to the Duke, I said. He needs to know that his name is about to be used in this. His Grace is already aware, Holt said. He asked me to inform you that he considers it entirely inconsequential, and that you are not to adjust your strategy on his account. I stared at him. He already knew. He anticipated it. When you were seen in the ballroom together, he considered the likelihood that Bastwick would attempt to use it. He factored it into his own calculations. His own calculations. I repeated this slowly. He has calculations. Holt had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. His Grace is not a man who enters situations without understanding their full dimensions. I sat back down. I needed a moment to take this in because the shape of it was larger than I had initially grasped. The Duke of Grenthorpe had not simply been a stranger in a ballroom who allowed a frightened woman to grip his sleeve. He had known who Bastwick was. He had known, or suspected, or calculated what Bastwick was capable of. He had sent me that card before 9 in the morning, not out of casual kindness, but out of something more deliberate, more considered. He had been watching this situation from a distance for longer than I knew. Why? I said. Not to Holt specifically, more to the room. But Holt answered anyway. Lord Cavett, he said simply. Bastwick was present for certain events connected to Lord Cavett 3 years ago. He was never implicated. He was careful, but he was present. Everything rearranged itself. Bastwick is not just my enemy, I said slowly. No, Holt agreed, though he certainly is that too. I pressed my fingers to my lips and thought for a long moment. Outside, one of the children chasing the lamppost had fallen, and the other was helping them up. Small, ordinary kindness in a gray street. What do we do about Sir Gideon Falke? I asked. We find something he cannot counter, Holt said. Something documented, specific, and witnessed by someone whose credibility cannot be purchased. He paused. The letters you gave me are strong, but we need one more thing. What thing? He looked at me steadily. We need Lord Bastwick to do something visible, something public and undeniable that proves the pattern of his behavior extends beyond closed doors. You want him to act out in the open. I want him to be exactly who he is, Holt said, where people can see it. I thought about Priscilla in the ballroom, her smile that never reached her eyes. He is not a patient man. That had been a warning dressed as a threat, and I had recognized it as such even at the time. Bastwick was not patient, and I was, apparently, no longer hiding. He will come, I said. If he believes the petition is working and that I am running out of options, he will come to press the advantage. That is what he does. Yes, Holt said, and when he does, we need witnesses present. Specific witnesses, Holt said. People whose names carry weight in the places this case will be decided. I looked up. We looked at each other across the drawing room. I need to write a letter, I said. To His Grace? To His Grace. Holt began closing his case. I will see myself out. He left. Aunt Honoria appeared from her corner with a fresh pot of tea and set it on the table beside me without comment. I picked up the pen. I had written 3 letters to the Duke of Grenthorpe in 4 days. Each one had been more honest than the last. This one would be the most honest of all, because it asked for something real, something that would cost him more than a footman's errand or a word to his counsel. I wrote that I understood now that this was not simply a petition. I wrote that Bastwick was using every door available to him, paid witnesses and friendly magistrates and my own family, and that I was not willing to lose because he had more doors than I did. I wrote that I needed allies with names that mattered in rooms where my name was not yet enough. I wrote that I was asking plainly and without performance for his help, not as a favor, not as charity, as a matter of shared purpose between 2 people who appeared to have the same enemy. I sealed it, sent it. Then I sat back in my chair and picked up my tea and thought about Aldous Grenfield agreeing to lie about me for a man like Bastwick, and I let myself feel the full weight of that particular betrayal for exactly 2 minutes. Then I set it down, folded it away, put it somewhere inside myself where it would not slow me down. The Duke's reply arrived before evening. I will come to Orvain House tomorrow morning. There are things better discussed in person than on paper. Below that, one more line. You said you are not afraid anymore. I think that is the most dangerous thing Bastwick has heard in a long time. I read it twice. Then, for the first time in what felt like a very long while, I smiled. Not the careful, controlled expression I wore in ballrooms and drawing rooms and corridors where someone might be watching. A real one, small and private and mine. Tomorrow, then. He arrived at 9 in the morning, not with fanfare, not with the elaborate procession one might expect from a man of his standing. 1 carriage, 2 footmen, the Duke of Grenthorpe stepping down onto the frost-covered street outside Orvain House, with the same unhurried stillness he had carried in the ballroom, as though the cold did not touch him, and time arranged itself around his convenience rather than the other way around. I watched from the drawing room window. I was not proud of this. Aunt Honoria met him at the door. I heard their voices in the entrance hall, hers warm and slightly overbright in the way she spoke when she was trying to appear less impressed than she was, his low and even. Then the drawing room door opened, and he was there. In daylight, he was different. Not softer, that was not the right word. More present. The ballroom had given him shadow and candlelight and the natural mystique of a man who stood apart from a crowd. Morning light in a drawing room gave him something else entirely. It made him real in a way that was considerably more unsettling. He looked at me across the room and said, Countess Orvain, with the same measured precision he had used in the corridor, as though no time had passed at all. Your Grace, I said, thank you for coming. He sat in the chair across from mine. Aunt Honoria installed herself in her corner with a cup of tea, and her embroidery, and the complete pretense of not listening to every single word. Holt told me about Falca, he said, without preamble, and about your cousin. Yes. Grenfield is a weak man in debt, he said. It was not cruel. It was simply exact. Bastwick would have found his price without difficulty. Do not spend energy on that betrayal. It will cost you more than it costs him. I looked at him steadily. I gave myself 2 minutes. Something shifted in his expression. 2 minutes. To feel it. Then I put it away. He was quiet for a moment. Then, so briefly I almost missed it, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite the smile that had almost appeared in the ballroom. Something adjacent to it. Holt also tells me you want to draw Bastwick into the open, he said. I want him to be exactly who he is, where people can see it, I said, using Holt's own words because they were the right ones. He has built this entire petition on the image of a wronged gentleman, a patient, dignified man whose intended broke faith with him. If that image cracks in public, in front of the right people, the petition loses its foundation. And you intend to be the thing that cracks it. I intend to stop hiding, I said. He has counted on my fear, my silence, my reluctance to make a scene because women who make scenes lose the argument before they open their mouths. I have been careful and quiet and strategic, and he has simply moved around all of it because careful and quiet do not frighten him. I paused. But you do. The Duke of Grenthorpe looked at me without speaking. He knows you are involved now, I continued. He knows your name has been connected to mine. He will see it as a threat, and threatened men make mistakes, particularly men who have never truly been threatened before, who have always had enough money and enough allies to feel untouchable. I held his gaze. I want to give him a reason to move before he is ready. I want him angry and exposed and reacting instead of planning. A long silence. You have thought this through carefully, he said. I have had 4 days and very little sleep. He leaned forward slightly, resting one forearm on his knee, and looked at me with an attention that was not comfortable and was not meant to be. It was the attention of someone taking full measure of a thing before deciding what to do with it. There is a dinner, he said, 3 days from now, hosted by Lord and Lady Vanthrope at Vanthrope House. Every magistrate connected to the petition circuit will be present. 3 members of the Lords. Sir Gideon Falke himself has been invited. He paused. Bastwick will be there. He has already confirmed attendance. I understood immediately. You want to be there too. I have been invited for some weeks. I had not yet decided to attend. His eyes held mine. I have decided now. And me? Lady Vanthrope is a particular acquaintance of your aunt's, I believe. From the corner, without looking up from her embroidery, Aunt Honoria said, We were at school together. I can have an invitation arranged by this afternoon. I looked at her. She continued embroidering with complete serenity. I turned back to the Duke. And when we are there? We do nothing dramatic, he said. We simply exist in the same room, visibly, comfortably, as though we are well acquainted, which by this point we are, and as though your situation is entirely under capable management, which it is. He paused. Bastwick will see it. He will understand what it means. A woman he has cornered, standing in a room full of magistrates and lords, beside the one man in England he has genuine reason to fear. He will not be able to help himself. He will react. He will react. I pressed my hands together in my lap. The plan was clean. It was also, depending on how Bastwick chose to react, not without risk. What if he does something that cannot be contained in a dinner party? I said. Then we will have exactly what Holt needs, the Duke said simply, and considerably more witnesses than we could have arranged deliberately. I breathed out slowly. There is one more thing, he said. His voice had shifted. Still even, still measured, but something underneath it had changed texture. Yes? He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He held it out across the distance between our chairs, and I leaned forward to take it. Our gloved fingers did not touch, as they had not touched in the corridor. And I noticed this the way you notice something that is not quite an absence but is aware of itself. I unfolded the paper. It was a letter, handwritten. The script was not the Duke's spare, precise hand. It was looser, more agitated, the writing of someone whose composure was beginning to fray at the edges. It was from Bastwick to the Duke of Grenthorpe, written 2 days prior. I read it. My hands went very still. In the letter, Bastwick did not threaten. He was too careful for threats on paper. But he implied, with the elaborate, practiced delicacy of a man who had spent years saying terrible things in ways that could not be quoted, he implied that the Duke's involvement in the affairs of Countess Orvain was noted, that certain associations could prove costly to a man whose reputation rested on clean dealings, and that it would be in everyone's interest for the Duke to remember that some battles chose their participants and some participants chose badly. It was, in essence, a warning. To the Duke of Granthorpe. I looked up. He threatened you, I said. He attempted to, the Duke said. There was no heat in it, no offense. Simply the calm of a man who had been threatened by larger things and had not moved for any of them. Your Grace, this changes things. If you continue to help me, he will come for you. His counsel, his magistrate connections, his paid witnesses, he will turn all of it toward you. I am aware. You should not have to carry that. Countess Orvane. His voice was quiet, but it stopped me completely. Lord Bastwick was present at an event 3 years ago in which a young woman was considerably harmed by Lord Cavett. She had no one to stand beside her in that room. She had no title, no family willing to engage, no advocate. The case was buried before it could breathe. His eyes held mine without flinching. I have spent 3 years ensuring that Bastwick could not do to someone else what he helped Cavett do to her. The drawing room was absolutely silent. Even Aunt Honoria had stopped embroidering. You have been watching him, I said softly, all this time, building the kind of case that cannot be buried, he said. Your petition is not separate from that. It is part of it. Every public thing Bastwick does, every move he makes in the open, adds to what I have been building. He paused. But I want you to understand that my reasons are not only strategic. What he has done to you is sufficient reason on its own. You do not need to be connected to a larger purpose to deserve standing. Something moved through my chest, too large and too complicated to name in a drawing room with my aunt 3 feet away. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because you asked plainly for help, he said. And plain requests deserve plain answers. I folded the letter, set it on the table between us. I will be at the Vanthorpe dinner, I said. Good. And I will not hide. I said it the way I had said it to myself in the dark at 2 in the morning, like a promise with edges. Not from him, not from anyone in that room, not anymore. The Duke of Granthorpe stood. He adjusted his coat with that same economic precision that governed everything he did and looked at me one final time in the morning light. No, he agreed quietly. I think you are done with that. He left. And I sat in the drawing room with my aunt's embroidery needles clicking softly in the corner and Bastwick's letter on the table in front of me, and 3 days until the Vanthorpe dinner, and I felt something I had almost forgotten the shape of. Ready. The Vanthorpe dinner was everything a winter evening in a great house should be. Candlelight on polished silver. The smell of pine boughs and roasted game. 40 guests arranged around a table long enough to host a small parliament, which was, given the presence of 3 lords and 2 sitting magistrates, essentially what it was. Lady Vanthorpe had outdone herself, as she always did, with the kind of effortless elegance that took considerable effort to produce. I arrived with Aunt Honoria at 7:30. I wore my finest, not to impress, to refuse to be diminished. Bastwick was already there when we entered the main salon. I felt him before I saw him, that same cold, crawling certainty at the back of my neck that had sent me running through a ballroom 3 weeks prior. But I did not run. I took a glass from a passing footman, turned to exchange pleasantries with Lady Vanthorpe's eldest daughter, Miss Cressida Vanthorpe, a bright, sharp-eyed young woman of 19 who seemed to find the entire evening very amusing. And I stayed exactly where I was. Bastwick saw me. Of course he did. He excused himself from his companion, a stout red-faced baron named Lord Tupwick who seemed confused by the sudden departure, and moved in my direction with the unhurried deliberateness I knew so well. But he had not taken 4 steps when something stopped him. Not a person, not a word. A presence. The Duke of Granthorpe had entered the salon. He was accompanied by 2 men I did not immediately recognize, both of them the particular age and bearing that suggested consequence. Davern Holt materialized at the edge of the room almost simultaneously, which I suspected was not a coincidence. The Duke did not look at Bastwick, he did not look at me. He simply entered the room the way he entered every room, as though it had always been waiting for him. But within 60 seconds, 3 things happened. Magistrate Lord Holroyd crossed the room to greet him. Then Lord Fenwick Ralt, who I recognized as one of Bastwick's own allies, approached with an expression that had lost some of its confidence. Then Sir Gideon Falk, who was standing near the fireplace with a glass of Burgundy and the untroubled demeanor of a man who had never lost a case, went very still and watched. Bastwick stopped moving. I watched him recalibrate, watched the calculations move behind his eyes. He had expected to find me isolated, perhaps accompanied by my aunt, manageable. He had not expected this. He had threatened the Duke privately, on paper, in the careful way of men who believed their threats were invisible. Now, the Duke stood in the same room as his magistrates and his own council and his supposed allies, and the threat had inverted entirely. Miss Cressida Vanthrop leaned close to my ear and murmured, "Lord Bastwick looks like a man who has just discovered the card he was holding is not the card he thought." I kept my expression pleasant. "Does he?" "Terribly," she confirmed cheerfully, and took a sip of her punch. Dinner was served at 8. By the arrangement of Lady Vanthrop, who had been briefed by Aunt Honoria with considerably more detail than I had authorized, but for which I found myself grateful, I was seated 4 places from the Duke on the same side of the table, close enough to be associated, far enough to be irreproachable. Bastwick was placed at the opposite end, beside Lord Tupwick and a gentle elderly viscountess named Lady Porthcain, who seemed primarily interested in her soup. For the first 3 courses, nothing happened. The conversation flowed around politics and horses and the particularly brutal December weather and whether the new road being laid through the North County would improve or destroy the landscape depending on who was asked. I spoke when spoken to, listened carefully, and watched Bastwick from the edge of my vision. The way you watch a fire you are not certain is contained. He was drinking more than he was eating. That was the first sign. The second sign was when Lord Fenwick Rald, seated within Bastwick's reach, leaned over and said something quiet to him that made Bastwick's jaw tighten visibly. I could not hear the words. I did not need to. Rout had spent 20 minutes before dinner speaking with the Duke of Grenthorpe, and whatever had passed between them had clearly rearranged certain loyalties with considerable speed. By the 4th course, Bastwick was rigid with contained fury. By the 5th, the containment was beginning to fail. It was Sir Gideon Falke who inadvertently provided the opening. He was speaking to the magistrate beside him about the current state of petition law, something about the recent amendments to breach of promise proceedings, and his voice carried in the particular way that dinner table voices carry when the surrounding conversation dips. "The difficulty," Falco was saying, "is that the law has historically asked very little of the petitioning party. A signed agreement is considered largely sufficient. However, there is growing sentiment among the more progressive magistrates that the conduct of all parties during the agreement period ought to be considered." The table had partially quieted. Several heads turned. "Progressive sentiment," Bastwick said, from his end of the table. His voice was too tight, too controlled in the way that things are controlled just before they are not. "Is that what we are calling it?" Falk looked at him mildly. "I am simply describing the direction of legal discourse, Bastwick." "The direction of legal discourse," Bastwick repeated. He set his glass down. "What I find interesting about this particular direction is how conveniently it appears at the precise moment when a woman who made a clear and documented agreement decides she would prefer not to honor it." The table went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people giving a speaker attention, the different quiet, the held breath kind. I set down my own glass. "Lord Bastwick," I said. My voice came out clear and steady and carried to every corner of the table without effort. "If you wish to discuss the matter of the petition, I am content to do so, though I would suggest that a dinner table is perhaps not the venue your counsel would recommend." Every eye in the room moved between us. Bastwick's gaze found mine, and there it was. Behind the careful surface, behind the practiced dignity of a man who had spent years being exactly what he needed to be in public, the thing I had seen only in private, that cold, coiled fury, the part of him that did not accept being countered. "My counsel," he said slowly, "is entirely confident in the strength of our case." "Then he is better informed than I am," I said with perfect pleasantness, "because the evidence I have gathered suggests rather the opposite." Evidence. The word came out stripped of any pretense, raw. "You have been coached by people with their own agenda, and you are standing here, in this room, and calling it evidence." Lord Bastwick. The Duke of Grenthorpe's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It simply arrived at the table like something heavy set down on wood, and the room responded to it the way rooms responded to him. Complete attention. Total stillness. "This is Lady Vanthrope's table. I suggest we allow her guests to finish their meal in peace. Bastwick turned to him, and here was the moment. The one I had understood was coming, but had not been able to predict the shape of. Bastwick looked at the Duke across that long candlelit table, and something in him made the worst possible calculation. The wine, the fury, the 3 weeks of watching his careful plan develop complications, the letter he had sent that had not produced the retreat he expected, all of it converged into one terrible decision. You, Bastwick said to the Duke, very quietly, you have inserted yourself into something that is not your affair. And people would do well to ask themselves why a man like you takes such particular interest in a woman he has known for 3 weeks. The silence that followed was absolute. Miss Cressida Vanthrope had stopped pretending not to listen. Lady Porthcain had set down her spoon. Sir Gideon Falca's expression had gone from mild to carefully blank, which I suspected was the expression of a man watching a case collapse in real time. The Duke looked at Bastwick for a long moment. People may ask whatever they wish, he said. The answer is straightforward. I take interest because the matter is of interest to me. The conduct that has been documented, both in this petition and in matters connected to it, is of considerable interest to several people in this room. He paused. As Lord Bastwick is aware. Lord, the connection to it landed like a key in a lock. Every magistrate at the table heard it. Every lord. Falke heard it. Ralt heard it. Bastwick heard it. The color that had been rising in his face drained out of it completely. He understood. In that moment, across that dinner table, he understood that the evening had never been about the petition. It had never been about drawing him into the open. It had been about this room, these witnesses, this precise and public moment of connection between his current conduct and the buried matter 3 years past that he had believed was safely buried. He had walked in of his own will. He had sat down. He had drunk too much and lost his temper and given the room everything it needed. Lord Holroyd, the senior magistrate, set down his fork. Perhaps, he said to no one in particular, with the measured deliberateness of a man who had just made a significant decision, certain matters ought to be reviewed more thoroughly before proceeding. That was all. But at a table of people who understood exactly what those words meant, it was sufficient. Bastwick stood. His chair scraped back against the floor. Lady Vanthrope winced. He said nothing else. He walked from the room with whatever dignity he could assemble, which was not much. And the door closed behind him, and the dinner table slowly, breath by breath, exhaled. Lady Porthcain picked up her spoon and returned to her soup. Miss Cressida Vanthrope turned to me with bright eyes and said very quietly, "That was the most interesting dinner I have attended in 4 years, possibly ever." I pressed my lips together and looked down at my plate and did not allow myself to feel it fully yet. Not here, not in front of 40 people. Lauder. The evening wound down by degrees. The lords spoke quietly among themselves. Falke spent a long time in conversation with Holt near the far window, and whatever passed between them left Falke looking considerably less untroubled than he had at the start of the evening. Aunt Honoria circulated with the ease of a woman who had attended 100 such events and knew precisely how to read a room that had just witnessed something significant. I was standing near the tall windows at the edge of the salon, looking out at the dark frost-covered garden, when the Duke appeared beside me. He did not announce himself. He simply was there the way he had been in the corridor, quietly present without performance. We stood in silence for a moment. "It is done?" I said. "Not a question. Holroyd will move to suspend the petition pending further review," he said. "Falke will advise Bastwick to withdraw before the review makes withdrawal look like the better of 2 poor options. He will withdraw. And the other matter, the connected matter, that moves forward," he said. "It has enough now. It has always had enough. It simply needed to be seen by the right people in the right context." He paused. "It will be seen." I looked out at the dark garden, at the frost on the stone path catching the light from the windows, each crystal a small, precise fire. "That woman," I said, 3 years ago, the one who had no one to stand beside her. He was quiet. "Did she know you were doing this for her?" "No," he said. "She does not know yet." "Will you tell her?" A longer pause. "When it is finished. When there is something solid to give her. instead of a promise. I turned to look at him. In the salon light, he was that same face from the morning drawing room and the corridor and the ballroom, layered now with context and weight and something I understood better than I had 3 weeks ago. He was not a man who moved through the world at its surface. He moved underneath it, where things were built and broken and occasionally repaired by people willing to work in the quiet and the dark. "Why did you come to the ballroom that night?" I asked. "The Whitmore Ball. You said you had been invited for weeks, but you are not a man who attends things without reason." He looked at me steadily. "Baswick had been invited," he said. "I knew he would look for a target. I did not know it would be you specifically." Something in his voice shifted, very slightly. A degree of warmth that was still careful, but was no longer hidden. I am glad it was. The weight of that sentence settled over me. Not because it was a declaration, not because it promised anything or reached for anything or crossed any line, but because it was honest. Precisely, carefully honest in the way that everything he said was honest, and honesty from a man like him cost something, and he had given it willingly. "Your Grace," I said. "Cassius," he said quietly, "if you are willing." I looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the frost-covered garden held its small fires. Inside, 40 people talked and laughed, and the evening moved toward its close, and somewhere across the city, Lord Baswick was calculating how to retreat from a battle he had already lost. And I stood beside the man who had told me to stay on a night when staying had changed everything. And I said, "Cassius." And the name fit the room exactly. "Delphine," he said, quietly, like something settled. We stood at the window together while the evening finished around us. Not touching, not performing, not pretending to be anything other than two people who had found each other in the middle of something difficult and had chosen, separately and then together, not to look away. The petition was withdrawn 4 days later. The connected matter, the one 3 years in the building, was heard before a full panel of lords 6 weeks after that. Lord Bastwick was formally censured. Sir Gideon Falkey declined to represent him. Lord Fenwick Ralt was notably absent from the proceedings. My cousin Aldous Grenfield sent a letter of apology that I read once and placed in the fire. Aunt Honoria declared the entire affair the most satisfying winter season she had experienced in a decade, and immediately began making plans for the spring social calendar, with an energy that I found both exhausting and deeply reassuring. And the Duke of Grenthorpe, Cassius Aldenmore, sent me a note on the morning the petition was withdrawn. It said, "It is finished. You were magnificent. I hope you slept." I wrote back, "I slept. For the first time in 2 years, I slept." His reply arrived within the hour. "Good. Now come to dinner. There are things better discussed in person than on paper." I read it twice. Then I smiled. The same small, private smile I had allowed myself weeks ago in the drawing room when he had sent me one word and I had stared at it longer than was reasonable. Then I called for Otley to press my finest, picked up my pen, and wrote back, "Yes." Just that. Yes. And that, after everything, was exactly enough. Now tell me, if you were in her place that night, gripping a stranger's sleeve with your heart in your throat and your past closing in behind you, would you have stayed, or would you have run? Drop your answer in the comments below, and if this story moved something in you, if it kept you here until the very last word, then this channel deserves your subscription. Hit that button for us. Every part of this journey was built for you, and there is so much more to come.